Okay, hello. It is Friday, June 12th, 2026. It is episode 44. I guess this should be a Lewis Hamilton special, but it isn't. We are talking a couple of things today. We're talking about No, it's not the Spanish Grand Prix, is it? It's the Barcelona Catalunya Grand Prix, whatever it's called. And we are talking about Pierre Gasly, for obvious reasons. If you don't know, you'll find out soon enough. And we'll have a look at any other news that crops up as well. But those are the two biggies. Now, I'm recording this at 9:40 a.m. East Coast time, so I just finished watching FP1. We're about an hour and a half away from FP2, so I don't know what happened in FP2. If you're listening to this, well, you definitely will be listening to this after FP2. And so we'll see what happens there. We can't draw a lot of conclusions when it comes to teammates because there were so many rookie drivers in this session and a lot of them in the major teams as well. So there are some general conclusions we can draw. Let me pull up the results of FP1. Let's have a look. All right, so George was on top by 0.2 over Piastri, but neither Lando nor Kimi were in FP1, so we can't compare that. Lewis wasn't in it as well. Dino Beganovic was in for Lewis. So yeah, Fred Vesti was in the Mercedes, and Fornaroli was in the McLaren. Then we had Charles in P3, Max in P4. By the way, Iwasa was in the other Red Bull for Hadjar. Then, in P5 and 6, we had Fornaroli in the McLaren and Paul Aron in the Audi. Now, that Audi was an interesting one. Paul Aron faster than Gabriel Bortoleto by almost a second. I will qualify this, however, by saying that whenever you went on board with Bortoleto, he looked like he was rallying. There was something fundamentally wrong with that Audi. I don't know what was going on with that car. The steering wheel was constantly moving back and forth. He just didn't have any grip whatsoever. So that's not really a fair comparison. Paul Aron doing an incredible job in the Audi. Fornaroli doing an incredible job. Oscar was 0.2 off and Fornaroli was 8.5 off. So 0.6-ish from Oscar. Not bad at all. Actually, from Fornaroli, current F2 champion. But let's see, Beganovic doing pretty well in P8. I think I missed Liam Lawson was in P7, by the way. And then Lindblad 0.3 off Lawson. Then we go into some regular drivers. Colapinto in P10. Then it's Behrman in P11. Then we have the aforementioned Bortoleto. Then it's Sainz, Iwasa, Vesti. Vesti 2 seconds off George. So that's quite the gap there. Then Ocon, a couple of seconds off Behrman. Gasly, Bottas, both Aston Martins. Fernando ahead of Stroll. And then Herta way off the pace. 4.3 seconds off the pace. And what's that, almost 2 seconds behind Valtteri? And he got 27 laps in, so, Valtteri put 23 on. So, poor Browning in the Williams didn't even get out, which is a real shame for him. There's not really a lot to read into FP1. I mean, this is probably slightly more representative in terms of the fact that they've already driven these cars in Barcelona, albeit in much different temperatures and conditions. But there were so many rookies. It's always FP1. They're always trying a bunch of stuff out. They've all got those pitot tube things in, and the track's the freshest it's going to be over the course of the entire weekend. And they've got the other support series there as well. So that's obviously going to be cleaning up the track over the course of the weekend, laying down rubber. So not an awful lot to take from FP1, other than the fact that the Mercedes and the McLaren do look pretty good. We've only got half the regular drivers there representative, and the same for Ferrari and Red Bull. But That's interesting. I mean, George really was a mile ahead, and then Piastri putting in some good times towards the end there. Only 2 tenths off the Mercedes, and then Charles 5 tenths off, and then Max really complaining on the radio about the car, almost 7 tenths off. So that's not untypical for Red Bull, right? Showing up with a really not great car and then them developing over the course of the weekend. So will be very interesting to see what happens in FP2 coming up when all the regular drivers are back in. I'm fascinated to see what's going to happen at Mercedes. I think we all are, right? Pressure's on George, zero pressure on Kimi. It will be just interesting again to see at a very typical track what the pecking order is amongst the two Mercedes. And on his day, George can blow the doors off. But as has been mentioned a few times, Miami not a strong track for him, Monaco not a strong track for him, unlucky in Canada, unlucky in China and Japan, won Australia. So, very weird time to be George Russell right now. I mean, he really did well against the 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, demolished his teammates at Williams, and yet this season it's all going a bit pear-shaped. But, he's a very strong driver. But Kimi just, what more can be said? We've said it many times on this podcast that Kimi is just a wonder kid, and he is just driving with such freedom. And even last year there were flashes of pace, but not, for obvious reasons, not the maturity and the experience, because he's just such a young guy, so you can't hold that against him. But this year, after a year's worth of experience in Formula One and being dropped in at the deep end in a pretty top team, even last year, a team that could win races, that did win races, they won 2 races, I think, last year. Yeah, that's quite the baptism of fire. So anyway, that's the sort of generics of where we are this weekend. Not an awful lot to read into it. But I think I looked yesterday at the weather and it looks again like beautiful weather all weekend. So that's not going to play a part. So we'll see. We'll see what comes up. All right, let's get into the meat. Let's get into the meat of it. Let's go to Pierre Gasly and Alpine and, more relevantly, the FIA. And after all was said and done, after Monaco last week, after the race, after all the penalties were awarded and the places were shifted around and George did his drive-through and all that business, it ended up finishing Antonelli won the race, Lewis P2, Isaac Hadjar P3, Gasly P4. However, it has been updated today so that Hadjar actually goes back down to P4 and Gasly gets promoted to P3 because his penalties have been rescinded. Now, the reason Gasly's penalties have been rescinded and all the other penalties that were dished out because of this speeding in the pit lane were not rescinded is because Alpine launched a right of review. So they presented new evidence and said to the FIA, look, we believe Gasly was not speeding. It's what we talked about the other day. Just because the equipment said he was speeding doesn't mean he was speeding, when it's been pretty clear from even during the race that this equipment was set up in a way that was giving false readings. And they presented some proof of this, and the FIA accepted that. And rarely for the FIA, they admitted their error, reinstated reinstated Gasly into P3, and he was technically should have been on the podium and is now 15 points better off than he was at the start of Monaco. Okay, all good, except a few things. It was very clear, right, that this was an error. Very clear to all aboard. If you've got the pit limiter on and you're exiting the pits with the pit limiter on and the pit limiter was set correctly and you didn't press it early, which wasn't the bone of contention, right, that they were pressing it early. They were still in the pits when this thing was measured, right? It was at the exit. I believe it was the exit that was the problem. Although I do see people talking about the cutting at the entry, so I'm not entirely sure about that. But it has been proven that this equipment was not functioning as it should. It was very clear that this was not correct. Now, call me a conspiracy theorist, but if they'd come out earlier, within this, 96 hours, something like that, post-race, and said, yeah, there was something wrong with our equipment, everyone that were awarded a penalty would come out and say, hey, well then we should get our place back, or you need to make amends because, like George, for example, he served a drive-through, which wouldn't put him miles up the road. He would have been fighting for a podium. However, because they didn't lodge a right of review, these other teams, except for Alpine, they didn't have to go through all that rigmarole. So they accepted Alpine's right to review, looked into it, and lo and behold, the 96 or 90 whatever hours it was has come and gone. And they said, yeah, no, fair play, we messed up. You can have your place back. Knowing full well that the time has elapsed for all the other teams to lodge any kind of complaint and get any kind of headway in this. Now, that seems a little unfair. And what on earth were the other teams doing? What, were they just too busy to look at their data and see the GPS data traces and figure out that they weren't going over the speed limit? What, were they just had better things to do? I mean, I know they had a race coming up, but Alpine managed it. Charles ended up going out of the race. He was the one that was impacted by Lewis's time penalty. Don't think he would have overtaken Kimi at the pit stops or anything like that with his penalty being served. Charles, like I say, was slightly delayed, but he went out anyway. So, I mean, I don't know if you can necessarily attribute that penalty to him going out because it was the road. Another problem that was not his fault that caused his issue, whether it was that or whether it was the brakes, who knows. So Ferrari, I think, not such a big deal. Don't think Oscar was necessarily going to be such a big deal as well. But again, if you serve the penalty in the pits, what ramifications, what butterfly effect is going to happen if you don't serve that? And, they've got to look at everyone else and what they were doing and where they were on the track. And, it's a can of worms. The big one is George, of course, George Russell, because he didn't serve his penalty at the pit stop. As we all know what happened. He drove in, they said stay out, but he came in anyway. He was waiting. There was some argument as to whether he thought he'd served it by sitting there waiting. However, some of the pit crew started working on his car. Others hesitated, thinking they had to serve the penalty. So there was clearly terrible communication. So then they awarded George the drive-through. That had to be served within a couple of laps after the restart, and that just put him completely out of it. He was out the points. I think he was like second to last on the road, something like that. It was just a complete disaster. So what, with all the personnel that Mercedes have, what were they thinking not at least trying for it? Because I think the FIA would have been in a much more challenging position. I'm sure Pierre and Alpine were thrilled that Mercedes didn't ask for a right to review, because I think Pierre getting that acknowledgement from the FIA that they messed up exponentially went up the chances, right? Given the fact that they wouldn't have to fix the mess of the Mercedes situation, it doesn't really hurt the FIA to say, okay, fine, switch places with Isaac, all good, all fair, right? But what on earth would they have done with the Mercedes? So I got to say, I think the FIA were let off the hook. I think obviously the Alpine were thrilled. I don't think it really affected the Ferrari all that much. I don't think the McLaren are really going to care if they're going to go up or down one or two places if they're off the podium. I think the Mercedes have got some answering to do from the George camp, right? Very, very interesting there. So that's my editorial perspective on it. Let's get some actual quotes from people. So this is the statement from Alpine. We welcome the decision made by the FIA to deem our right to review as admissible following the final classification of last weekend's Monaco Grand Prix. As a result, the stewards have rescinded the 2 5-second penalties imposed on car number 10, which reinstates the team's third-place finish. We would like to thank the FIA and Formula One management for its transparency and cooperation throughout the right of review process and for reaching this decision. The team's focus is now very much on this weekend's Barcelona-Catalunya Grand Prix and striving for the best possible result with both of its cars. Okay, so of course they're happy about it. I think it's a shame that Pierre didn't get to stand on the podium. I'm sure he's going to be a bit miffed about that, but he gets 15 points, and that's golden in this championship race, both as a driver and the constructors. So there's actually further quotes here on Racing News 365, and the article is called Alpine Voice Pity for Rival F1 Teams After Major FIA Decision. Quote, I'd be upset, end quote. I'm fascinated to read what this is. So Alpine boss Steve Nielsen has claimed he would be, quote, upset if he were George Russell and Mercedes after Pierre Gasly's Monaco Podium was reinstalled. All right, so let's go reinstated even. So let's go to some direct quotes by Nielsen. So he said, we were aware that there had been issues with that part of the track on Friday and on Saturday, so we had some doubts about it. Because of that, we'd already warned our drivers about it, and when we started seeing all these penalties come in the race, whilst we didn't know exactly what the error was, it was not unreasonable to think that there was something wrong. I've been doing this for a few years now, and across the season you see pit lane speeding maybe 4 or 5 times in the whole year. So to see 6, 3 of which were hours in one afternoon, combined with that we knew about Friday and Saturday, you think, okay, something is wrong. Whilst we didn't know exactly what it was, we were very sure there was something wrong. I feel for the other penalised drivers, we'll never know, I guess, whether their pit lane speeding was real or not. So it's just really unfortunate situations, because with our case, it was relatively easy to undo it. Because it was all added after the race, but with theirs, George Russell, for example, we will never really know, and I don't know how you would begin to unpick that. Pit lane speeding is not appealable, which is why we use the right of review, and I feel for them, and if I was in their position, I'd be upset. So, yeah, I mean, you can't appeal a pit lane, but you can request they re-look at the situation, especially if they've got extra information to share with the FIA. Now, what I didn't mention is that in the FIA's announcement on all this, they blamed Formula One management for setting it all up wrong. FOM, right? So even the FIA were like, still not our fault, which I guess made it easier also to, award this penalty. So it's all a bit of a mess. And I don't know, George, if he didn't have bad luck, he'd have no luck, right? I mean, even the fact that Mercedes didn't even request this right to review. What is interesting to me is if one team requests the right to review, and that deems the penalties void, why does that only apply to the team that requested the right of review? That just proves that the penalties were void, right? And that were awarded unfairly. That then should, like a court of law, that's sort of a precedent, right? And you can use precedent to say, well, then our penalty was unfair too. Now, technically that 96 hours has passed, but, that seems to be too easy to be let off the hook. That's like statute of limitations, right, in the US law. That does seem unfair. I guess you have to have some time limit, or you can just go back into the annals of history and try and do a massa and try and, replay all these situations for years and years and years. So I guess there has to be some time limit, but just like 3 or 4 days doesn't seem to be quite fair, particularly before the beginning of the next race even. It's proven that you, as the FIA, did something wrong. You awarded these penalties that shouldn't have been awarded. Yeah, I've got to think, if it was deemed that a driver did something illegal or a team did something illegal, the car was proven to be illegal more than a few days after a race win, would the FIA strip them of that win even though it was late? And is there a statute of limitations on that as well? I don't actually know. I don't know the rule book inside out, but just posing the question. All right, so that's the big news of the day. So the other thing that is worth keeping an eye on this weekend is the Mercedes power unit across all 4 teams, right? Across Mercedes and McLaren, of course, Williams and Alpine. This thing looks fragile. And particularly Norris is teetering on the edge already of grid penalties by replacing parts that are outside of the pool already. And it's a hot weekend. It's a relatively fast track, so that big long straight, bunch of fast corners, a lot of fiddly bits as well. But I know Red Bull have brought in a new power unit, at least the ICE part of the power unit, I believe, for this race. That was always going to be the case. That's part of the reason why they said that Max's power unit failed in Monaco. It was right at the end of its life cycle already. So that is going to be very interesting to see what of the Mercedes power cars get to the end of the weekend without a major power unit change and potentially without grid penalties. So while it's fast, this thing looks fragile. And I do wonder, with George getting the failure in Canada and them having to review and bring something in, Kimi is maybe skating on thin ice a little bit with this power unit situation. Another thing that I think is worth talking about real quick is that Leclerc has switched brake disc manufacturers. He is now moving away from Brembo and using the Carbon Industries brakes that Lewis brought in this year. Lewis has always used Carbon Industry and has never got on with the Brembo. Like when he had to drive with Brembo last year, hated it. And this is another benefit of having a 7-time world champion with the extraordinary experience that Lewis has. What he is bringing to Ferrari is stuff like this, right? I've been there, I've done that, I know what works, I know what this car needs. Let's go with Carbon Industries, and Leclerc is following suit. And this could really help Leclerc. Be very interesting to see what happens. So after the race, and, you know, I don't know if he's back down from this or not, even with the road coming up, but Charles was very critical of the Brembo brakes. And him switching to Carbon Industries suggests that he still thinks that was the thing. You know, the way he described it, like he was putting a fractional amount of brake pressure on and it was still being unreliable and unpredictable and, you know, still snatching. So let's get some quotes from Charles. This was after Monaco. So he said, "I cannot do anything. The only thing I can do is not brake for the last corner. But in an F1 corner, not braking in the last corner ends up in the wall anyway. I put the least amount of brakes I could possibly do, and it's not even braking. It's leaning my foot on the brake." I mean, what on earth? What on earth? So apparently he is testing the brake discs of Carbon Industries this weekend in Barcelona. So he will use this as an opportunity to sort of A/B whether it is the discs themselves or something else that is affecting him. You know, he's been using Brembo for years and years and years, so why all of a sudden would he have this problem? I don't really get it. There's a good article here on the race by Gary Anderson. So he said in the article what Leclerc's new brake discs will give him. He said, "It's not unusual for teams to do this, as although Brembo remains a Ferrari partner and supplies the rest of the braking system, the feel required by the brake discs is very particular for different drivers. From my past experience, Brembo and CI have fairly different characteristics. In the intervening time, the differences have got smaller, but I can put some numbers on it as an example of how they behave." So I'm just going to compare these two numbers here. So he says here, for Brembo, the efficient working temperature is around 200 to 900 degrees C. If I compare that to Carbon Industry, that is around 350 to 1200 C. So they are more efficient higher up the temperature range, which makes sense that they would try this in Spain. It's very hot there. Higher than that, in the Brembo, the disc pad wear rate goes out of control and you need more cooling, which can be detrimental to overall downforce. So yeah, you would open up the brake ducts, but that affects downforce. So the Brembos are better for drivers who are gentle or at least more progressive on the brake pedal. And so that is generally better for circuits where lower overall braking energy is required. So yes, slower tracks, lots of tight corners, not these big braking zones out of big long straight bits, so Monaco, Singapore, etc. That's Brembo. So for Carbon Industrie, this allows the team to reduce the amount of brake cooling, which helps with the downforce, of course. However, because they work in a higher range, they have to get the brakes up to temperature. So this is better for drivers who brake harder into corners. That is Lewis through and through, right? He is a late braker into the corners, last of the late breakers. You know, that's perfect for him. And so this is also better for circuits where there is overall higher braking energy, which would be Spain. And you would think that Brembo would be fine in Monaco, but clearly Charles had a problem with that. So this is much more in-depth. Again, I don't want to completely plagiarize this article on the race, but definitely check it out. It came out just today, or just yesterday, actually, June 11th. But this is very interesting to see that. So be interesting to see what happens between Charles and Lewis and if this braking. And really interesting to see the data traces of the two drivers and where they are gaining and losing on each other, and if this brings them closer together at a very typical track that they all know. Everything else is pretty normalized. So, yeah, I mean, you got to say, if Charles was having problems in Monaco, had he not moved to Carbon Industrie, he would have had major problems in Spain, according to those numbers by Gary Anderson. So, yeah, interesting to see what happens there. Okay, I've got to wrap this thing up. I will be back tomorrow with a qualifying report. We can talk about everything that happened in FP2, 3 and qualifying. We'll get a really good benchmark on peak pace, right? And where the pecking order is between the teammates at sort of peak. How do we get around the lap as fast as possible? Not necessarily race pace, that's for Sunday, even though they'll do a bit of that in FP3 and FP2 probably. But yes, I hope you have a great day. Hope you enjoy the World Cup. Bit of a boring first game, but, you know, it'll take a while to warm up. Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye for now. I've been your host, Jamie Muffett. You can find me on social media for more of this rambling nonsense under my name or F1_Jamie. This is an RPS audio production.